agility is kind of like the alignment of your car. If your best practice is to hold that steering wheel straight on a straight road, that works great right until your car is out of alignment. Now, if your car is out of alignment, now it's pulling, and it's really hard for you to keep that steering wheel straight because you need to make those adjustments for the car that's out of alignment. And if you don't, you're going to crash into one of those trees in the picture here. So now if I'm saying to you, best practice is to keep the steering wheel straight, why aren't you doing that? You're in a very difficult job because your goal is to keep the car on the road, but your mandate is to keep the steering wheel straight, and you can't do both. So you're in a very difficult position. So the idea here is that structure is supporting the practices, but there's a feedback loop there too. And if there's some freedom where you can have a little bit of leeway to maybe adjust the steering wheel when the car is out of alignment, that works better. And that alignment, that structure supports all of the functions of the car, right? Not just the steering. So it really is an underpinning that makes everything else really work well and flow, which is the subtitle of the paper, was using structure to enable flow. So you'll just think of it as a car. All right, let's talk a little bit about me, because Janice gave me a really good introduction, but just a little bit here. Blogger, author, speaker, entrepreneur, we talked about. I am a mother of 3, so I have that added complexity. But really my passion is about workplaces that are soulful, productive, and fun. And what I try to do in all of my work is connect that soulfulness to the practical aspects. Because what I find is that there's a lot of people out there that are spiritual and soulful, even in the business world, and a lot of people that are really practical, but connecting those two, and we do this in Agile, right? You have Agile practices that make teams so much more happy, and you see it. So just making sure that we're connecting, like, what is the mechanism and what is that ultimate outcome? Because honestly, at the end of the day, folks, if we do all these wonderful things to make companies more productive and more, higher profitability and things, and we're all miserable, it really wasn't worth it. So we think that so I believe that we can be productive and soulful at the same time, and one feeds the other. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. All right, the white paper. So we talked about the white paper a little bit. So why did I write this white paper on structural agility? I just want to share a little bit. The reason I wrote this is I was going through the domains of business agility on the Business Agility Institute website. And when I got to structural agility, I didn't really get it. So in an effort to try and get it, I kind of dove in, and as I was diving in and trying to understand it, I wrote down. So what I wrote down is in the paper. So that's kind of what I did. What I saw was that there were a lot of frameworks and a lot of thinking models, but there just wasn't a definition of, it was like, well, holacracy, well, Spotify, well, safe. And I was like, that's all great, but what is it? Like, what is it that's making these frameworks qualify? So I really tried to back up and put a stake in the ground to say, well, here's what structural agility is. Now that we know what it is, go pick a framework if you want, or pick multiple frameworks if you want. So that's the whole point of the paper. So simple way of saying, I really know nothing about this, or knew nothing about this until I went to go understand it. And so I'll share with you, in case you didn't understand it, what I found out. Okay, so here's our agenda. What is structural agility? Because I didn't know. What are the principles of structural agility that support that definition? How does structural agility use organizational tensions? So that's a bit of a deep dive into one of the principles where I think it's really powerful, and we'll just do a deep dive there. And then where do Agile team structures fit? Because we've had Agile structures for 20 years, as we just found out from Miles. It's a 20-year anniversary coming up. So, right, next year. Yeah, next year. So what about all those structures that we've been using for years? How does that fit? And then at the end, I always, like I mentioned, I like to tie everything back to soul. So how do these structures enable souls of us as individuals and as the organization? All right, so let's get started. Before we start, one organizing principle for you. What we want to do sort of in general is do more of growing this, and it's the tree on the left, and there's a guy there too, if you can see him. Do more of growing living systems and less building factories and machines. And the reason I use that as an organizing principle is because living systems can grow outside their boundaries in ways that surprise us, in ways that are adaptive and responsive to the environment. factories and machines only do what we've designed and built them to do. So if it comes to pass that they need to do something different, we need to redesign and rebuild them every time. Whereas a living system is adaptable in the way that we say business agility needs to be adaptable. So we really do seek to create conditions to grow a living system, to grow our organization as a living system, rather than directing the building of a factory or the building of a machine. So that's just sort of our organizing principle as we move forward, and you'll see that show up in the structural agility principles. So just a seed to plant here, structural agility fosters individual and organizational soul. I already mentioned that, but I'm going to plant the seed with you. So as we go through it, you can kind of keep that in the back of your head. And when sometimes people say to me like, soul, that's no place in business. Or what does that even mean, soulful? So I find that people really understand the opposite of soul a little bit easier than they understand soulfulness. So if I said to you, what is it like to be in a workplace that's soulless or soul crushing or soul sucking? Most people can understand what that means. When I say soulful, they say, I don't know what that means, but soulless, we know what that means. So think about it as the opposite of soul crushing. We'll get back to soul towards the end. So as I went to go define what structural agility means, I realized that I had no idea what structure means. So I had to define that first. So I went to I'm not an org design or org development person, so I had to go to my org design friends and ask them what structure meant. And they gave me a whole bunch of words and books to read, which I boiled down to this one simple sentence here. Anything that creates boundaries and rules to organize people and activities towards a shared purpose. So that was eye-opening to me because I thought structure was like org chart. And apparently there's a bit more to it. So it is about how we bound work, projects, epic stories, right? These are all structures that bound work, and how we bound people, although that doesn't sound nice, but how we organize people and put boundaries around people and groups, and then how we connect the work and the people, right? So that's what we mean by structure in an organization. So that was a bit eye-opening to me. I don't know how it is for you folks, but that was a definition that now I can start to think about, what does structural agility mean? So we put together this definition with some, I should mention too, I had several wonderful collaborators on this paper that helped with all of the definition and the principles that I want to give a shout out to, because really they know a lot of stuff that I really didn't know. So that all that knowledge fed in here. So structural agility, we defined as the capability to continually create and adapt structures that give life and enable the flow of work in sync with and in response to the organization's changing environment. And that is what is, you'll notice the background here is sandy looking. I used a sandy beach there because this is what we think it is, right? It's written in sand. We're open to feedback for changes or edits to this, because maybe it's not perfect, but it's better than nothing. So this is our starting point. So go ahead and, if you would, in the chat window, if there's something that jumps out at you from that definition, some of the words that jump out, not just because I bolded them, but because they jump out for you, go ahead and enter that in the chat. I'm going to give you a minute. Continually create. Yeah. So we'll talk about that also when we get to the principles in a minute. So I'm going to hold that continually. Give life, right? So there's a lot of living systems thinking that's incorporated here. One of my collaborators is mainly a living systems person. So that helped. In sync, adapt. Yep. Changing environment, enabling constraints, in response to and enabling flow, right? Gail, it says, I believe it also needs R, continually. All right, so let's take a look at now the principles, because this was a really good stake in the ground, but I needed more. I needed more tangibility for like, well, what is it and what isn't it? And sort of following the model of the Agile Manifesto with the values and principles, we thought definition and principles would help me bring it to life a bit more. So we went and we put 9 principles to it. So as I go through these, we're going to do a poll after. But as I go through them, be thinking to yourself, or maybe jot down on a piece of paper, which principle is most needed in your current or most recent organization. So what's most needed, and then which one creates some dissonance for you? Because sometimes some of these create some dissonance where I feel a little resistant to that one, like for whatever reason. So jot those down and we'll do a poll and see where we are as a group. But first, let's go through them. So 1, we view human organizations as living human ecosystems, inherently interconnected and able to flourish. So I sort of gave you a little bit of a hint of that in the beginning when I showed you the tree and the factory. And the idea here is living systems is the key, but also able to flourish. So every organization has the potential to flourish and thrive, right? They may not be doing that now, but they all have that potential there that can be mined. Okay, number 2. Continuous, which that word seemed to pop up a lot on the chat. Continuous design allows the organization to evolve. So this sort of is the nice way of saying it doesn't mean that a bunch of consultants get to come in every 5 years and restructure organization. That's what that's saying in a much nicer way. My collaborators help me be nicer. But it's continuous and it's coming from within, and we'll talk about coming from within, but it's a continuous design. So at the beginning, you might have consultants come in, and I'm a consultant, so please call me in, but and I don't mean to trash consultants because I am one, but it is putting in place a structure that allows for the structure to continually evolve without having to be revamped every, on this lurching kind of cycle. Okay, number 3. Agility only exists when we create conditions for it instead of directing activity. And some of this language might be familiar for you because it's been used in other places. I didn't invent it. Ron Heifetz talks about creating conditions, like leaders creating conditions for successful organizations instead of directing. So leadership agility uses this language a lot, but it's the same with structure. Right? It's about creating conditions for the organization to flourish, not directing the organization, not structures that enable directing. Number 4, we thrive by leveraging dynamic tensions. So we're going to do the deep dive into tensions in just a few minutes, but just to give you a little bit of a preview of that, tensions, or polarities are sometimes called, are sort of seemingly opposing forces that can be destructive, but also can be generative. So making sure that we can manage and leverage those tensions to be generative is one of the key principles. Okay, number 5, we enable flow through hierarchies which are naturally in service to each other. So I wonder who's cringing at the word hierarchy. You might be. So what we believe is that hierarchies, there's nothing wrong with hierarchies. Nature has hierarchies. A tree has a hierarchy. So if you think of a tree, right, the tree trunk they're in service to each other. So the tree trunk is feeding nutrients from the soil to the leaves. The tree trunk is in service to the leaves, and the leaves are in service to the trunk. They're feeding water and sunlight into whatever it becomes, chlorophyll, I guess, into the trunk. I'm not a biologist. But they're in service to each other. And of course, I left out the whole root system, but you get what I'm saying, because there's a hierarchy there too. No one's saying that the trunk is the boss of the tree. Like the leaves all have to get in line when the trunk comes around. Like that's not how it works. There's a hierarchy there, but it's in service to each other, and there's no power over. What happens in organizations is we have a hierarchy that's based on power over. Like it's based on a big pyramid of power over, and it's not in service to each other. The bottom is in service to the top, and that's where it starts to fall apart. So really, when we look at structural agility, it is the levels of the hierarchy being in service to each other. I will say one other thing about hierarchy, though, because there is a lot of movement to flatten hierarchy, and I am in favor of that. Natural living systems do have a limit of levels of hierarchy. I think it's like 3 and 4, like 3 for land and 4 for aquatics. I think I may be wrong. Again, not an ecologist, but so we do want to limit really steep hierarchies don't work in nature and they don't work in organizations. So let's just say it like that. Okay, number 6, adaptations for how we organize emerge from within the organization. So this is that the organization itself figures out how to adapt. And that's using information from the external, but it comes from within. So again, similar to number 2, we're not having external consultants necessarily come in and tell us how to organize. We are smart enough within the organization to adapt. So number 7 is at every level, the organization has a way to shed and spawn from within itself. And shed and spawn is something we'll talk about because that's actually one of the dynamic tensions. But again, it's that the organization can shed and spawn without it having to come from above. So if we have what typically happens in organizations is like someone from above decides that we need to cut a product line or have a layoff or, kill a project. It's super inefficient, first of all. But second of all, it needs to come from within the group. And there's a lot of change that needs to happen to make it safe to be able to shed your own product line, right? So there's some work that has to happen there. Number 8, intentional development, both individual and collective, fosters organizational evolution. So this is an idea that you may be familiar with as the deliberately developmental organization. So this has been out there. It's not new. We didn't invent it, but it's certainly a principle for structural agility about purposefully developing individuals, and not just skills, but as whole people that are part of the organization for the long haul. And then also developing the organization as an organizational dynamic. So we actually actively work on that, not just tasks. And one of the things here that we sometimes talk about is, when we put people into a position where you're not allowed to take any training that is not something you're working on, right? Not something that applies to your current job, right? So you can only take training that applies to your current job. And then, oh, by the way, you don't have the skills we need, so we need to let you go and go hire somebody else, right? So that's putting people in a really difficult and frustrating position because we're not intentionally developing you for the future of the company. So that's one of the examples of how that would be different. Okay, and then number 9, shared identity allows for trust and self-organization. We're going to get into internal and external a bit when we talk about the tensions, but the organization has to know who it is, we have to know who we are. And once we know who we are, then trust kind of comes out of that. Decision making becomes easier. We can filter information as it comes in because we know who we are and we know who we're not. And that also enables self-organization. Really hard to self-organize when we don't really know who we are. So those are the 9. So let's, Janice, maybe you can go run that first poll, which is going to ask you which of the principles are most needed, hopefully. Oh, okay, most notably absent in your recent organization. So the second question, or did I say? Oh yes, most needed is the same as most notably absent, sorry. I worded it differently. So go ahead and answer that. Are you guys seeing the poll? Okay, we got a couple of answers coming in. You got another 30 seconds and we'll end the poll and see what you all answered. Let me scroll down here, see what's coming in. All right, so I see. All right, Janice, go ahead and end the poll. Finish up your voting. Okay, so let's see. So it looks like actually we have a bunch across the board here. I guess we got the most votes for at every level the organization has to have a way to shed and spawn. So we're going to talk about that because I agree that that's a big one. But it looks like a lot of them resonated because we have some answers across the board here. So that's interesting. Agility only exists when we can create conditions for it. Sure, and that's a living systems thing. And then we view organizations as living human ecosystems. We thrive by leveraging dynamic tensions. Great, because we're going to get into that in just a moment. And hierarchies being naturally in service to each other. These are some of the things that we're missing. Okay, great. Thank you. Okay. And then let's do one more poll just for fun. I'm going to close this one. Can you run the... Sorry about that. All right, go ahead and run that second poll, Janice. There we go. phone never does that. That was weird. Oh, you know what? It wasn't me. Maybe it was somebody else. All right, so let's see that second poll and see if we get any different answers about which one creates resonance. Is that running? I'm not, oh, I lost it. Oh, here it is. Okay. So yeah, so which one did you feel resistant to? The hierarchies, yeah, that's always one. The intentional development. And then things emerging from inside the organization. Yeah, okay, see the hierarchy. Yeah, that always causes some dissonance. Because we're so conditioned that hierarchy means, somebody said to me, it means that there's this sense of superiority in a hierarchy. And that just word has a lot of connotation. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and end the poll. I guess I can do it too here. Janice, you don't have to do it. Share results. Okay. So you can see the results there. So it's mostly that hierarchy one that created some dissonance. And good. I'm glad that it is, because it's something for us to really dig into of what is it about hierarchy that we don't like. Okay. So I'm going to keep going here. Janice is, oh, actually, before I go, because we are going to go into to the next piece here. Are there any questions in the chat that we need to address at this point? Because this is the definition, right? This is the definition of structural agility and the definition of the principles. And again, you'll see the sandy background, which means written in sand.
No questions as yet, Jardena. Just a couple of people agreeing with some of the definitions as you were saying them.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. All right, well, let's keep going here. So I promised you that we would go into the a little bit of a deep dive into the dynamic tensions or the structural tensions. So tensions, as I mentioned before, are values that appear to be opposing, but can be have an opportunity anyway to be synergistic. So what we want to do here is, one of the things that creates conditions for agility is bringing awareness to those structural tensions that are at play. When you manage them poorly, it creates oscillation. I know, Joel, you're on, and that's some of the language of, we talked about earlier, Robert Fritz. So two of the thought leaders with the tensions, just so you guys know, Robert Fritz was someone who'd written about this many years ago, and the recent work on it under the title of Polarities is done by Barry Johnson. And Barry Johnson kind of has this process for unpacking these, which we'll go into a bit in a minute. So poorly managed, they result in oscillation, which is a Robert Fritz kind of word, or lurching. When you manage them well, they can result in creative productivity, or they can be generative. So that's really kind of what we want. We want them to be productive. So what we did was we took a look at what are the 10, well, we didn't know there was going to be 10, but there's 10. What are the 10 tensions that really show up a lot when we talk about structural agility? And so we call them the meta tensions, because there are probably many, it depends on, each organization is different, but these are the 10 that really do kind of show up and other things fall from. So let's talk about what they are. And as we go through them, we'll talk about how you might manage them or what you might do with them. But the first step, I will tell you, is just awareness that they're happening. And that gets you really, really far. Okay, so there's 3 that we've named as the kind of the worldview. So 3 tensions that really shape the worldview of the organization. And then 7, the other 7 of how they manifest themselves, how they show up. So the first one is performance and health. And when we think about performance and health, I use the Brian 2, for those of you who know Brian 2, his example of, it's like the difference between a GPS and the dashboard on your car. Yes, I use cars a lot as analogies. But the difference is the performance is like the GPS. Like, I need to get to the airport at a certain time, and that performance is important to me because I don't want to miss my flight. The health of my car is my oil healthy, and have I had an oil change? Do I have gas? How's my tire pressure? Because without that, I may not make it to the airport. And if I don't make it to the airport to go, to a client, then I may not have then that money to go keep up the maintenance for my car. So both things are important. You need to be monitoring the health of your car, and you also need to make sure that you know where you're going. So performance and health both important, but sometimes in organizations we see that they can be at odds, where somebody is super interested in keeping the organization healthy and somebody else may be interested in some short-term revenue, right? So these things happen, but they're both important is the point. Okay, leadership and followership is another one that comes up a lot. Leaders point the way, leaders create direction, and leaders create conditions for success later. But without anybody following and executing on that, we don't really get very far. So both things are important, and that followership feeds back into the direction of the leadership. So again, these are all in service to each other. There's not a hierarchy, but we need both leadership and followership. And I'm a big proponent of everybody being a leader, but not at all times. So in a different context, in one context you may be leading, in another context you may be following. But everyone has the potential to lead. And actually, sometimes the most leaderful thing you can do is follow. So stability and change, I think, is the one tension that really shows up a lot if you've worked with agile transformations, because you get this people who don't want to change because they want things to be stable and they don't want to rock the boat, and they don't want to make the change. And then people who really do love change and really do want to rock the boat and scare the stability folks. Both things are necessary. The stability is what's keeping that company in business a lot of times, but the change is what's getting it ready for the future. So they really do need to work together. Sometimes I see this strategy where we separate the stability people from the change people. And then, later on, we may try and force the change on the stability people. And it's not always people, right? Sometimes it's just process in general. But separating them is not the answer. It really is that they do need to be in service to each other, because the change will create stability for later, and the stability is creating the opportunity for the change, right? So they really do need to be hand in hand. And what we've done traditionally in organizations is there's some awareness that we need stability and change, or any of these tensions, but this is a great example, because you see something like a compliance organization and the product organization, right? For example, so you've got the product organization who loves change and the compliance organization who is risk averse, right? That's their job, to monitor the risk to manage the risk for the company. And we've put them in place, so hoping that if we create the conflict between them, somehow we'll end up in the middle. But that's not really how it works. So we really need to be collaborating and working together with these polarities so that we can collaborate on how we can create change and keep stability. All right, manifestation of the worldview. So how do these things show up? So structure and flow, which is of course the subtitle of the paper, creating enough structure that you're enabling flow without blocking flow. And then flow is now then informing back into the structure and helping alter that structure as things start to flow. So I think about like a stream, right? A stream starts to, the structure enables that flow of water, but then as the water starts flowing, it changes the riverbank, right? Or the stream bank. So they inform each other. Long-term and short-term thinking. So this is one we'll see show up a bit in a little while, but this is one of those things where it can really be destructive when people talk past each other. There's somebody who wants to think or invest long-term and somebody who wants to think and invest short-term. And then we end up just separating them. Let's put the long-term stuff over here and the short-term stuff over here. But really long-term is enabling the short-term, and the short-term is feeding into the long-term. So they really need to be working together. Exploitation and innovation is sort of similar to stability and change, but we want to exploitation, and I mean that in a very good way, or harvesting maybe, is getting the most out of the assets you have, right? Your cash cows, and then innovating for the future. And those two things don't need to be at odds, but they often are. They really should be informing each other and in service to each other. Internal and external, I want to talk about for a minute. So this is one that comes up a lot in the Agile world, especially lately when we talk about customer centricity. So if you think about internal, we talked about this is the identity of the company. How do we operate internally? Who are we as a company? And then external is everything in that outside ecosystem, shareholders, but particularly customers. So when we talk about customer in the center, that means that we're taking the external and putting focus on it, which is super important, but also important to know who you are and not be whipped around by the customer whim. right? So there's two things. You're getting information from the customer and then reconciling that with what the internal is. Who are we, right? Or, as a company, and how can we respond to that? So when we think about customer at the center, I often think it's customer and identity at the center. It's both, right? You can't lose who you are, but you also need to get that feedback. So you don't want to put it such a tight boundary around who you are that you don't hear anything from the outside. So internal and external is really important to have that flow between them. All right, parts and whole. So we're kind of familiar with this in Agile, right? This is the local and global optimization. The company has to work well as a company. The parts need to feed that whole and be optimizing for the whole, but the whole also needs to be in service to the part. So as individuals, we need to be fulfilled. As teams, we need to be able to know what it means to do a good job. So there's a two-way street here. Then we have centralized and decentralized, which again, this is another one. So in Agile, we love the decentralization, but some things need to be centralized. And when we think about structural agility and the structure of organizations, I see a lot of lurching where it's like, oh, we're too centralized. We need to be totally decentralized. Oh no, we're too decentralized. We lost economies of scale. We need to re-centralize. The bottom line is some functions need to be centralized and some functions need to be decentralized. And pushing down decisions to the lowest level is a great idea. And doing something centralized, like it's like a lot of the procurement being centralized actually does save some money, but decentralizing the decision on what to buy, right? So you really have to look at that and be very intentional about what's centralized and what's decentralized, and not just sort of wave a wand and say, we're going to be all decentralized. And those two things work together. The last one here is spawn and shed. We talked about that a bit because it's one of the principles. I know it's not fair to have a favorite tension, and most people probably aren't nerdy enough to have a favorite tension, but I have a favorite tension, and my favorite tension is spawn and shed. And the reason it's my favorite is because really it is about being able to create new when you need to. This is about the responsiveness and the adaptability of your organization. I need to be able to spawn from anywhere within the organization. If I need to create a new structure, I need to be able to create a structure. Organizations are pretty good at spawning. We are terrible at shedding. We are terrible. So, we've learned in Agile to be able to shed work, but we haven't learned to shed structure. So creating structures that allow structures to go away with it being safe, right? I want to be able to, my team, it doesn't make sense for my team to exist anymore, but can I do that in a way that doesn't put everyone's job at risk? Right? So I think that that's important. And we hang on to things way too long in organizations, way too long, because we wait for someone to tell us that we need to shed it. And we don't realize the cost of that. So the cost of, I've heard before, like, we'll just keep that project going. Not that many people working on it. It's no big deal. But you have a whole bunch of those. And then it's in a report every week and we have to review it. And there's meetings about it because we've got 20 projects that we shouldn't be working on that now we have, 10 meetings about. So it pulls that energy away from other stuff that can be more productively worked on by the organization. And it's sort of invisible. You don't realize that that energy is getting sucked out of your organization and could be used for something else. So just being conscious of that and making a really deliberate practice of shedding is really important. So let me take a pause here and we'll do a poll. So what's that next poll, Janice? It's which of these tensions something. Which tension is most at play in your most recent organization? So go ahead and see if one of these, if you had a favorite tension. I won't tell anybody if you had a favorite, but if you did, go ahead and mark it on the poll. I have a favorite. Yeah, so I see stability and changes showing up. That's big in the Agile world. Structure and flow, long-term, short-term shows up. Parts and whole. Oh, somebody likes spawn and shed, my baby. Okay. I'm just going to give you another few seconds and then we'll end the poll and see where we ended up. Okay, I'm going to end the poll. Get your votes in. Okay, so long-term, short-term was the winner. if there had to be a winner. Let's see how my baby did. Oh, one vote for my baby. Swan and Shed. Parts and whole got some structure and flow, stability and change, and leadership and followership. Yeah, and that long-term, short-term is something that you can use that tomorrow in your organization, because that comes up in meetings and drives meetings into complete unproductiveness. When people are talking, if I'm talking about the 5-year plan and you're talking about what's in the next sprint, and we're not connecting those dots, that's going to be a really useless meeting. So really one way to just bring those meetings back is just to say, okay, let's talk about time horizon here. What's the time horizon and how are we connecting between long-term and short-term? All right, I'm going to stop sharing the poll. All right, so I think this is a good place to take a pause and see if anyone had any questions. Did anything come up? I'm just going to put my do my time check here. Okay, we're good.
Yeah, nothing's come up in the chat. I think everybody is very much enjoying what it is you say. Nothing, no questions, anybody?
Well, while you're thinking, I will mention, so we gave a talk on this last night in Atlanta, and some of you came in. I know there was some confusion on the time, so some of you were from that, missed that last night. But this slide we talked about a lot because people said, I could just stare at this all day, because really there's so much we can do here. And I will mention that in the paper, we do unpack, we do delve into each of these and break them down, because sometimes this language doesn't resonate, but saying it in a different way or more specific may resonate. So there's a whole bunch of permutations of each of the 10 if you wanted more. And then what we do with these, what makes it useful is, again, understanding what tensions are most at play in your organization, having a conversation about it, and then unpacking, well, why are these two things important? What's the deeper purpose here for these two opposing forces, and what's the fear behind each of them? So like I gave the example of stability and change with the compliance and the product organization. What's the fear of the compliance organization has with the change in the product organization, and vice versa? And having that conversation is so productive, because you have the compliance people saying, I'm afraid that you people are just going to launch products and that's going to put the company at risk and we're going to go out of business. And the product team says, I'm afraid you're going to stop us from launching any products and we're going to go out of business. Right? So having those conversations is really useful to uncover what some of the fears are and work past them. Something pop up in the chat. I see it's a 7 now. All right, let's move on. No, you're saying no. Okay. So let's move on and talk about the traditional Agile org problems, org patterns, and what that means in terms of structural agility. So the traditional team patterns and structure patterns that we had in Agile solved a really specific problem that was common across IT departments, and it solved it beautifully. And some of those problems exist in other organizations and across organizations as the organizational whole, and some of them don't. So when we force them, they don't necessarily always work. So let's look at what those are. Actually, before we do that, I want to say one other organizing principle here. An observation that an executive made to me was, yeah, Agile solves execution problems. And I thought, well, what else is there? And they said, we have strategy, right? It doesn't address strategy. It addresses execution problems. And we had execution problems in software. Boy, did we have execution problems in software. And it solved it. Like a lot of that got solved, but it doesn't solve the execution, and it doesn't necessarily, it doesn't solve the strategy, and it doesn't necessarily connect the strategy with the execution, which we have some tools now. And I'll just give a shout out to OKRs. So OKRs really are helping us connect strategy with execution. Yeah, we love OKRs. So it's filling that gap, but we're not ready to call it a day yet. Okay, we're not done. That's a great start. So let's talk about what structures we had with Agile when we started with software, and why it helped and where it fell short. So teams. So the basic structure, the core of all structure of Agile was teams, right? That was the whole deal. And that worked so beautifully because what we had in software before was handoffs between individuals. I mean, the project plan was really individual to individual handoffs, and working in a team allowed us to release some of the structure and just let the teams work in a much more fluid and natural way. And it was wonderful. Sometimes it falls apart, I think, at the larger organizational level, because it really doesn't scale where we have teams of teams of teams of teams forever. It doesn't address, I mentioned before, it doesn't address the strategy context. So we look at leadership teams, they're not really a Scrum team. They can use some of the practices, but they really don't only work with the one team, right? The C-level team works with their organizations and their peers, and they work in the ecosystem. So we can't really bound them tightly in a Scrum team. Some of the team practices work, the practices are great. So the next piece, if we look at teams that are execution focused and we drill down, the other thing that I have preached for years and still do when it makes sense is stable, dedicated teams. So that solved the problem that we had in IT, if you remember, where we had project work and we were on so many different projects, and it was not really, you could be on so many different projects and the projects were churning. So over time you were in multiple different projects on multiple different teams. There was no real focus on team building in those projects because they were so fleeting. It was just about get the tasks done. I talked to people didn't even know who was on their team because they were on so many different, project teams. So we solved that problem by having stable, dedicated teams, and we can actually build a high-performing team and have them learn how to work together, which was awesome. Where it falls apart is when we talk about being adaptable and responsive, that having dedicated, stable teams across your company creates rigidity, right? So these teams are not cross-pollinating. These teams are not, it can hamper innovation because they're not talking to each other. Now, that's a solvable problem by creating some porous boundaries between the teams. But when we created some pretty tight boundaries around those Scrum teams, and it really did hamper our ability to be adaptive across the organization. Cross-functional teams. Cross-functional teams was another thing. So the problem was that we had handoffs across function, from dev to test, from app to app. So when we were trying to do these large enterprise systems, it was so onerous to cross the function. So by creating cross-functional teams, we broke down those silos, and it was like, so it was a beautiful thing, and work started flowing. Where it breaks down is that so one of the reasons it worked great is because software is a non-repeatable task, right? We were doing something new every time. So it works great. We really had to collaborate. It's all knowledge work. It's all creative knowledge work. Not all teams are like that. Operations teams may be doing repeatable tasks that you just lose that economy of scale when you create cross-functional. Also, we break down functions and it doesn't even make sense because we don't even have functions anymore. The other thing that happened was when we started to level up in the organization, cross-functional the scope of value became so broad that it was really hard to encapsulate in a team, right? So that as you start to move up the levels of the organization, cross-functional just doesn't make sense anymore. They're all cross-functional anyway. Think about your C-level team. Of course they're cross-functional, right? That's what they are. All right, T-shaped skills. So this one's a little controversial, but let's talk about it. Boy, in software, we became so over-specialized that I worked with an organization, 65 people with 65 specialties. So one person won the lottery, they didn't. But if one person won the lottery, we were kind of screwed. If one person was sick, we were pretty screwed. And really, when you're talking about technology and you're a trained technologist, you can probably span across different technologies, learn different modules, learn different apps. It's possible because we are all trained in computer science and programming and engineering. When I worked with a team that was copywriters and artists, they laughed in my face. You want the copywriter to do the art? You want the artist to do the copywriting? You think about a hospital team. The teams work for hospital teams, but the nurse isn't going to be the surgeon. The anesthesiologist is not going to do the surgery. The surgeon's not going to do the, tech is not going to be the tech. Like, it just doesn't work. So they're having their roles really defined, because in Scrum, we would say there's only 3 roles. There's Scrum Master, product owner, and everyone else. Well, that doesn't work on all teams. That doesn't work when you have artists. So really looking at the T-shaped skills, and I'm a big believer in T-shaped skills and, learning other disciplines and cross training, but you just have to really look at whether or not that makes sense. The other thing too about fungibility, which is really what T-shaped skills gives you, is it does devalue the human contribution. So while we want to cross train, and it's somebody said last night on the call too, get empathy for what is going into other people's work. I think that's all wonderful, but devaluing to say that we're going to make you fungible so we can just plug and play humans, that doesn't feel so good. And the last one here I would say that came out of Agile was self-organization. So this was a beautiful thing for software because we had a bunch of really smart people that weren't using their brains. Like we were just telling them, do this, do that, do this, don't think. And when we introduced self-organization and let the teams come up with the how, then we all of a sudden got all this brain power unlocked that had been missing. And it was a beautiful thing. This is one where, you know, the times that self-organization doesn't work is when you have a fear-based organization or when, and then the teams are so traumatized that they don't know how to embrace empowerment. And this is the one where I would say, fix that. If that's the problem, it's not a problem with self-organization. You need to fix the fear. You need to get, the team needs to be work over the trauma that they've been through from being in a fear-based organization. So this is the one where I'd say, keep pursuing it. It's really not, I think self-organization and having everybody, you know, having everybody's brain power involved is a beautiful thing. All right, so that's the Agile org structures and how they sort of fit or don't fit into the structural agility. All right, it was a great start, but we just need to let go of our attachment to some of these things because they don't always apply at in the bigger picture. All right, let me keep moving here. So now I'm going to take just a minute to, how are we doing on time? Okay, good. This is perfect. Just take a minute to talk about soul, and then we'll just open it up for full questions. Is that working, Janice? Good? Okay. So we said in the beginning, structural agility fosters individual and organizational soul. And we've even given some examples as we've gone through the principles of, you know, where does soul maybe tie in, or, you know, I talked about devaluing human contribution. So there's some things there where we can see that souls get crushed. But let's take a look at what it means to have soul. And then I'll maybe try to connect the dots between structural agility and how we can actually connect it to soul as we work through the actual mechanisms. So one of the things at Souls at Work that we talk about is having a soul at work depends on three things. It really rests on three tenets: power, freedom, and connection. So you can maybe already see where some of this ties in with structure. That always happens. Okay. So power, we had even talked about with the hierarchy, right? Someone having power over you doesn't feel very good. But power means that I need to be able to have the power to, or be able to take the actions that I need to take to get my job done in a way that's successful and fulfilling, right? But I need to be able to take those actions. I need to have that ability. So that's what power is. And one of the things that might stop me is someone having power over me. The other one is freedom. So freedom, when we talk about freedom here, it doesn't mean that everyone's running around willy-nilly, but it means that I can make the decisions that are good for the organization without fear of, without being constrained by things that have nothing to do with the organization. So the example that I give here is more, you know, having a mortgage or house payment or car payment or kids in college, like all of those personal financial pressures you have sometimes cause you to make a decision at work that might not be ideal, because I don't want to lose my job. I don't want to lose my bonus. So I'm just going to do what my boss says, even though I know it's wrong. Right. And I've been in situations where somebody was doing something and I kind of called them out on it and said, you know, this is bad. Why are you doing it? And his answer was, this is what my boss wants, and I have a mortgage. And you get, you know, one person doing that and it's a little sad. You got thousands of people doing that, and now your company's making bad decisions. Right. I mean, and then we see things like, you know, Enron or Wells Fargo happen because as a company now you're making bad decisions based on personal fears. So that, you, of course, not bringing your soul to work. And then connection is the third one. So human connection is something we all want. Human connection is something that people will get even if we tell them they can't have it. So we're pretty good at that. But where it can really be soulful is by creating intentional opportunities for intentional connection. So, and not trying to block the human connection from happening. So that being said, power, freedom, connection, we've come up with this 5-step, or I've come up with, I should say, this 5-step process to figure out how to bring soul to any situation, right? How to bring soul to work in the micro, like what's the mechanism? And this process can be used with just individually as you're working through something, or with a team. So maybe at an offsite when you're working through a process that just nobody likes. So I think about things like status meetings people don't like, performance reviews people don't like, budget planning. We'll talk about budget planning, and these kind of things. And how do we bring soul to them? And how do we make them, the process, really meet work and be productive and meet the soulfulness of the workplace? So let's look at the process, and maybe we'll use, you can think in your head of a soulless process that you might be involved with. And I'll use the example here of budget planning while we talk. But it's even like when we talk about budget planning as a structure, but even then adapting structures. So the first step is, what is the soulful purpose? So go back to that budget planning. Well, everyone hates it. Why do we do it? Well, we do it. And so everybody has a different answer here, but most of the time we can say we do it so that the company can optimize the investment so that the company will thrive. But even just for us as a team, we do it so that we have a thriving workplace and we have a job, right? We maintain our livelihood and we get to still work here. So two, then, what is it that makes it soul crushing? So here's where you can really unpack with the team of what is it about this process that we hate and really vent. Sometimes if there's really a lot of tension, I will make that one first. Like maybe we need to get that out even before we talk about the soulful purpose, but I like to be positive for the first step. So what is it that makes it soul crushing for budget planning? Well, I'm pitted against my peers. I don't really know if I'm going to get approval or not. I feel like people may lose their jobs if I don't get approval. Like there's a bunch of things about the budget. It takes forever. It takes me away from the important work that I need to do. So a lot of things about budget planning can be soul crushing. So just kind of laying those out. And these two will become your design criteria for making it better in the future. So we want to know, why are we doing this and what sucks about it, right? So let's get all that stuff out. Then we talk about number three, and this is why I shared with you the 3 tenets of soul. So where does that process violate power, freedom, and connection? So budget planning, maybe it violates power because I have to sit and wait I have to beg for approval and wait for it. It violates connection because I can't talk to my peers. I can't move laterally with my peers, or move money laterally. And then number 4 is what tensions are at play. So one of the tensions we talked about earlier was long-term and short-term thinking. This is a big one for budget planning. So that tension is at play because we're trying to allocate some funds, and there's usually some tension between, is it a long-term investment or is it a short-term, right? So let's kind of call out what tensions are at play. And then we get to the last step. So those first 4 steps really, again, are design criteria and unpacking of what's going on with this soulless process. And then number 5 is the reimagining. So what would it take to bring in soul here? So what would a budget planning process what would a soulful budgeting process look like? What would budget planning look like that wasn't sucking the life out of us? What would that be like? And sort of maybe clean sheet and just reimagine what it could be like. But you're not going to lose the purpose. You're not losing the purpose of why we're doing it, but we are maybe trying to eliminate some of the soul crushing aspect of it, right? And we're figuring out then how to make our tensions generative. So that's the 5 steps to soul. You can start with something simple. You can start with status meetings. And I won't tell anyone if you start with an agile practice, right? If you say, well, our 15-minute stand-ups are kind of soul crushing, so what do we need to do about that? Some teams drop agile practices because they do find them soul crushing. It's true. So why? Why does that group find it so soul crushing where other groups love it? Okay, so that's the 5 steps. Let me take a pause and see if there's anything. We're just going to wrap up in a minute, but let me see if there's anything in the chat that we need to call out. Janice?
Thanks, Jardena. That was amazing, and there was quite a few things. I don't know if Ian put quite a few interesting things down here. I don't know if Ian, you want us to unmute you and you'd like to just chat to Jardena directly.
Cool. Yeah. Hi, Ian.
I don't know if he's trying to unmute himself or me.
Well, let me do this. I know I said what's in the chat. I'm just going to do 2 wrap-up slides. I think it's 2. And then I can see all your faces and we can talk. How's that sound?
Perfect.
Cool. Let's do that. So just a wrap up of what we just did. This is like the agenda only in reverse. We defined structural agility. We introduced the 9 principles. We learned those 10 meta tensions. And then we compared the agile team structure to structural agility. And then we linked structural agility to soul, or attempted to. So I have a goodie bag. I will send these slides to Janice and you can distribute them, but I have a goodie bag for you here, swag bag. You can download the structural agility white paper if you haven't yet. It's on the business agility site, but I put a link for you. Join the soulsatwork.org movement to help bring soul to work. And then my business is rosettatg.com. Rosetta used to be Technology Group. We've evolved into Agile. And then I do have this upcoming book on transformational leadership, which, similar to what we did with structural agility, I will connect the spiritual and the practical. So very practical aspects that then help us have better workplaces. And that is all I have. So I'm going to stop sharing so I can see everyone's face again and we can all see each other's faces.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Jardena. I mean, I have a bunch of things that were just really incredible for me that I related to there, but also learned through that. But I won't talk first. So Ian, I see that you are unmuted. Do you want to take it away with what you put in the chat?
I have no idea how to start the chat. I mean, to be honest, it's like where to start after listening through so much. I guess I did make some comments, but that sounds like starting in the middle. That it reminded me of cultural dimensions.
Oh, say more. I'm not familiar with cultural dimensions.
Oh, well, like say you compare a culture in one place with a culture in another place, and the tribe, the peoples, the region, the country, whatever, they may prefer achieved. You may observe that people get to the status through achievement. That sounds good. On the other hand, if it's ascribed, it means that people will rise to senior positions thanks to privilege. Very tension. It's hardly a meritocracy in that case. Let's take decisions. An organization, any culture can prefer a tendency to make decisions methodically as we imagine, using process, or impulsive. After all, the most brilliant people are at the top, and they may be the founders, right? Deductive and deductive reasoning is an interesting one, because it can get locked into one or another and then flip. That's what I mean.
Ah, okay. I'm going to write this down. Well, I guess I can listen to the recording. Okay.
Because the tensions made me think of that. I would expect other people could think along those lines as well.
Yeah. Cool. Thank you. That's a good insight. Yeah. And the idea is we need both, right? We need both.
A little bit of both, yeah, from time to time.
Right. Right. But I always had this idea that we need both, but they can be separate. But they really can't. That was the aha for me was having them both and having them separate aren't the same thing as having them be generative and work together.
Although a little bit of ascribed is inevitable, probably, but it's difficult to make an argument in favor of it.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and again, it's about that permeable and porous boundary. So there may be a boundary, but there needs to be movement between through the boundary. And I think of that like the cell wall, right? In living systems, you have the cell is contained. There's a boundary around it, but there's nutrients flowing in and out.
I really like that. Because then it does makes me think, if we've got all of these tensions, and often I'm on one side of the tension, not looking at the other side of the tension. So it's really nice to be reminded that both of them actually have such a good place within any kind of structural agility or organization. And I kind of then, where do you get the balance? At what point is the balance? And how do you not course correct, but make sure that you're not ever jumping too far from one side into the other? Or how do you get that balance?
Yeah.
Miles also had a good question. Miles, I don't want to ask all the questions. You want
What
to?
you got, Miles?
It's not so much a question, it's probably more an observation, Jardina. So I come from an org design background many years ago, and it was because of the inflexibility of org design that I moved into Agile. So sort of my question was, first of all, when talking to this about to HR people, how many heart attacks have you caused? That's number one, because the challenge with HR in terms of the stuff they need to unlearn is the first thing they're going to say is, okay, so then how do I put that into my grading system? And then the next part of it is going to be, but then how do I structure my ERP system? Because jobs need to sit in a very hierarchical structure in an ERP system. So they almost become blockers into this flexibility and agility that we're trying to drive. And it's about getting them to unlearn, the traditional org design principles, and start building in the agile design principles. So I was just wondering if you'd had any experience with that, and any suggestions around tackling that.
So I don't have the answer, but I want to give you a little bit of the background of what I found. Because when I first started to think about this stuff, which was a couple of years ago before I wrote the paper, but I've been thinking about the limitations of org design in Agile. And I went to the org design community, and there's some forum there to sort of get to know those people and kind of pick their brains. And what I found out was, sure, some of it's rigid in implementation, but what I found out was that there's some professional jealousy there. Agile is doing what they've always wanted to do, and they just weren't able to do it. And actually, one of them even said to me, the geeks have figured it out because really, this is what org design people wanted. They just could never get it to be accepted in an organization. So to your point, in how do we do it in an organization? I don't know if I have the answers to that, but I think that there's some openness to talk about it with some of those more traditional folks who are kind of, once they got past, there was some animosity of, well, you're doing stuff we've always been talking about. You're just, like there was that. But once I got past that, it's sort of like, yeah, this is what we've been trying to do. Thank you for opening the doors for us. But as for the ERP system, I have no idea. I don't know what the answer is there. I'm seeing some people do more role-based than job-based, but there's a lot of work to do there.
Thanks. Is there anybody else who's got a question for Jardina? It's a really great opportunity. Put your hand up, and there we go. Joel.
Hello. My question is, I really enjoyed it. I'm into the world of structure from another angle completely, and I really enjoyed your application and how you're talking about it with the Agile world. I'm not from the Agile world, but I really appreciate your perspective and all the stuff you bring to the soul world, the whole bit. So my question is, I see all these individual tensions, polarities in the chart, and I know that they're true, and they happen, and you guys know, everybody else knows they're true too, I think. So question is, if you can understand each individual polarity and know that they exist, do they also fit into a more global, integrated, organizational, structural strategy polarity, or an overall structure? How do they fit into an organizational's overall direction?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I guess the one thing I would say is usually when I'm working with an organization, they're limited by, there's one or two, maybe like two or three of those polarities that are at play where they really need to address it. They're not looking at all 10, but I think it's a great question of how do we use I think what you're saying is, how do we use those tensions as design criteria to build into the structure? Right?
And make sure that the structure overall is supporting all those individual polarities, which you could use to your advantage.
Yeah. So again, I'm going to say, I don't know the answer, but I love the question.
Let's talk.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do. So with that, and also with Miles, I do want to say, like, I kind of wrote this paper hoping that lots of people would have ideas that, sprout out of it, because I certainly don't have all the answers, but I'm asking a lot of questions. Thanks, Joel. Yeah, let's definitely talk.
I guess that one also for me resonated with something you said right at the very beginning when you said it's just so great to actually be aware that these tensions are happening. That's the first step, and it is, you know. I often I don't realize it. When you see it and you're aware that it's happening, it's easier to actually formulate which way it is that needs to be.
Yeah. And what we see happen, what I just saw happen recently, is you sort of do an exercise with a group to bring their awareness and identify what are the big tensions at play. And then they go on to have another meeting and talk about something else. And those tensions are, they're calling them out because now they're aware, and it's changing the trajectory of that meeting that's following, right? So you see it like real time, really cool. Joel, yes.
I should just share something. I'm just itching because you guys both talking about seeing it and in the organization, when that observation and that getting it is really the first step. You know, first step in recovery is understanding you have a problem, right? So I just share one thing really quick. It's a Robert Fritz principle called structural conflict. So I'm in a chair that makes it perfect for me to explain this to you in just a few seconds. If I have a goal that I'm going towards and it's on the wall ahead of me, imagine this rubber band around me, this idea of tension that Fritz talks about. And so as I move towards accomplishing my goal, I decrease the tension in the rubber band because the rubber band has been stretched out because there's a discrepancy between where I am and where I want to go. But the conflict is, there's another rubber band behind me that is about my belief system. Like, I can't think I can do it, or this organization never does it, or you know how they are. And whatever the thinking is that holds me back, there's another rubber band that's actively in play, also stretched around me. And as I move towards my goal, I get pulled back by this second rubber band that's part of the conflict. So what happens with most people and organizations when they're trying to do good stuff is they're going like this, and they're doing, that's what the oscillation looks like. So it's kind of a weird thing, but when you see it, you can actually look at what's going on in the organization and actually see it happening. I want change. No, I want continuity. I want to invest. No, I want to, economize. And that everybody drives themselves nuts because they don't have an overall arching principle for moving forward.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And then the other thing that happens is when a new leader comes in for that organization, it lurches, right? Because a new leader says, "What's going on here? We don't have enough stability." And then the next leader comes in and says, "We don't have enough change." Yeah. Thank you, Joel. I love that illustration.
Yeah, really good. Who else? Anybody got a question? While you are thinking about it, please do unmute yourself and ask if you have it. If you are shy, please put it in the chat and we can ask it out for you. See Marcus there says great presentations and questions and answers.
Thank you, Marcus.
Yeah, I also want to say thank you. This was such an incredible presentation. It's got me thinking a hell of a lot. It's got me really asking a lot of questions. So I definitely want to continue the chat.
Yeah, so if some stuff comes up for you after, feel free to reach out on LinkedIn. Maybe we can even keep it under the post that you had about this session so that we can keep the conversation in one place. But I would love to hear, if you think about this later, reach out to me or whatever you need to do so that we can keep the conversation going, because I put a stake in the ground here, but this is not the final word. So let's keep talking.
Fantastic.
Hi.
I appreciate being here.
Can I maybe ask a question on hierarchy? I really liked your presentation, and there's a lot of provocative stuff. I actually I agree with you on hierarchy. I think it's overlooked. And I see that there was one comment that said that hierarchies form themselves naturally in human organizations, even if no one enforces them. So I agree with that. My question is, what would you suggest is the goal or the role of an organization with different levels of expertise, experience, and subsequently hierarchy as well? for example, if you can comment on that, like for example, in many religious organizations, it's the role of the elders or whoever to train people or whatever. And the reason I'm asking this is because sometimes you can live in a organization or work in an organization where there's this belief that we are all, you know, it's everything, we believe it's horizontal and everything is kind of the same. And then there's no handovers or training or anything like that. So maybe just comment on that.
Yeah. It's such a good question, thinking about hierarchy in terms of, so I normally think about hierarchy in an organization in terms of scope, right? So span of control. So I'm working on my Scrum team and we're developing this one module for this one piece of software. And then the team of teams is working, of course, on the whole system, whatever it is. And then as we go up the hierarchy, like say the VPs are working more on, or maybe there's a team working on the product suite. And then we have the team working on like all the products in the company and our strategy in the market. So the scope gets bigger, but that doesn't mean, actually, let me give you this analogy. The analogy that I like to use here is baseball teams. Well, I don't know. Do you have baseball in South Africa? I guess so, right? No, not as much. Okay, a sports team, right? So the players are specialists and their talent, they have great talent and they can make a ton of money in their skill playing the sport. The team manager has a different job, right? It doesn't make him or her more important or less important than that star player who's famous, and the manager is maybe not as famous. And then you have like the team owner, and then you have the industry organization that's creating a space for all these teams to play each other, right? None of those is more or less important than that star player, but they have different roles. So, but you brought another dimension, which is maturity, right? And maturity and expertise, which I think kind of maybe even cuts across some of that scope boundary. Does that help, Roland?
Oh yes, that makes sense. Thanks.
Yeah. Cool. So, I mean, I of course we need hierarchy, right? And it's funny because you look at these frameworks that say we have no hierarchy. I won't name them. But then I look at them and I go, oh, how'd they do that? And then they're like, well, instead of having boxes, we have circles. And in the circles, then we are related to each other. And I go, that's a hierarchy. There's a hierarchy there. You're just calling it something different. So it is hard to get away from.
I love that though, and it's so true. It is so true. Oh.
All right.
Cool, Ben?
Yes. So I had to switch your video on. I was sitting outside.
You put a shirt on, so that's good.
Say again?
You put a shirt on, so that's good.
Yeah. I was sitting outside. It got a little bit chilly outside. Yeah, I just want to add on to the hierarchy thing. And it's something that I'm picking up, and it's something that's sort of, I don't know, causing a misunderstanding or problem on my side. Is sometimes we do depend on the hierarchy, the guys that have the knowledge, that's got that little bit of a leadership role, to do a high level look in what needs to be delivered. So I'm talking from a delivery perspective, not from a business. So then that happens, and that gets committed to a company and say, listen, this is what's going to be, but never goes that one level down to the team to actually understand from them what will it contain to do the work. So that's where I sort of have a little bit of a problem with the hierarchy thing. Is sometimes when it comes to the level where you sit and talk with the customer, and a customer asks you how long it's going to take for this, you're solely dependent on that hierarchy to deliver the high level view if you want to. But then that high level view becomes the date fixed in time when stuff needs to be delivered. So is there a way, how would you say is a way to bridge that? I'm trying to bridge that in a way to say, yes, it's great. We can depend on the knowledge because that's where the knowledge is. The reason why they are there is because they have the knowledge, the understanding, and know how to do it. But also you can't use them to say how long it's going to take to do something because they're not going to do the actual work. So, I think the question is actually how can you with the structure, agility, and everything that we have, and all this new interesting stuff that's coming up, and it's mind blowing. And how can we use that to try and bridge that gap to say, yes, use it, but don't use that as a fixed time and date. Because if you think about it, we're pushing agility and we're pushing to say, listen, let's get away from the old waterfall processes. But if you go and sit back and you see that a lot of customers want a pinpointed time and date. I know deadlines is important, but then it falls back to a waterfall structured process of a milestone has been set. You need to deliver here, you need to deliver there. And it takes the whole agility out of the whole thing. But we're offering agility because we do Scrum. So, yeah, so I think that's how can you bridge it?
Yeah. So there's so many concepts in Agile that the situation you're describing is so contrary to. But I think there's a few things that jump out at me that have worked for that. And again, I don't want to profess to have all the answers, but one of them is, having that product owner. So essentially, it's a chief product owner, I guess that's saying this. Not commit to time, right? That they figure out the what and the team collaborates on the estimate for it. But the other thing that jumps out at me, because that doesn't always work. So that was one of those things with Agile that didn't always work. So if you have, so again, here in the US, we have football teams. That's not soccer. But if you have a date where I'm going to launch my sports season, that work has to be done by that date or else you're missing that sports season. So there's a date there. And if you miss it, you're not getting to that app, you're missing your window of opportunity, just trash it. So what when you look at that iron triangle that we flipped for Agile, right? So in Waterfall, it was like time, quality, and cost, right? Is that right? What it was? So look, you can have 2 of the 3, but you can't have all 3. So if you have a date where it has to be done, that means that the scope is flexible. If you have scope that can't be changed, then that means that the date's flexible and cost, right? So you just can't have all 3. So, if there is a date that can't be changed, sometimes that's true, but if it's not true, but that means that you're going to give up something else. So having that product owner or chief product owner understand that and not commit to those things without knowing where the team can flex, I think is tricky. I do want to also bring in, with OKRs, one of the things, a practice with OKRs is always having the OKR, a collaboration between the 2 levels of the hierarchy. So this could also work there, where it's that one level, there's just no single level that gets to be the single, like the person who makes the decision. It always works between levels. So we do that with OKRs. It's like 2 levels work and together, and then the level below works with the level below them to make sure that we all agree on what the outcomes and key results will be. So that might also work here. It's like, don't commit to anything without, essentially the thing is, don't commit to something without talking to the team. Yeah, so hopefully that's helpful. I think there's some other Agile practices that might help, which, also the thing about the product owner doesn't get to say the how, right? So.
Yeah.
Cool, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks for the question, Ben. I just wanted to let everybody know we are out of time, so we might get kicked off. So I don't want to not say goodbye if we do get kicked off. So there were just 2 things said in the chat that I wanted to say, but before I do that, in case we get kicked off, Jardena, thank you so much for this presentation. Thanks for being with us. I'd love to keep the chat going. So on our meetup for this event, guys, let's keep it the questions going, then we all get to learn from it. Obviously, I'm sure more than welcome to message Jardena directly, but it's nice to start the conversation and learn from each other. So thank you very much.
Oh, you're so welcome. It was a pleasure. And I will send the slides so that you will have them.
Thank you. And the recording, as soon as it's ready, I will post that also. Well, I'll send it to Jardena, but I'll also post it on the Meetup event, so you can all access it and pass it on and show it to others. I do like what Mark has said in the chat, though. There could be more subtle hierarchies as opposed to more blatant ones. For example, we will solve the problem versus I will tell you how to do this, which was a good one. And then there was another that said from Mary, she was saying, thanks, stimulating thinking on recognizing and balancing tensions, food for thought on better understanding potential conflicts in terms of tensions in work and personal lives and communities. So thanks for sharing.
Yeah, that's great. I love that.
Yeah, very cool. Great.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, thank you so much for joining us, Jardena. We really, really, really appreciate it. And I look forward to chatting further. Thanks, everybody, for your questions.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you. Thank you so much.
You're so welcome.
Yep. Thank you. It was great.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.